introduction. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is Comprehensivist Wednesdays that we do in conjunction with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. I am delighted to have Sanjay back. He's doing a series on neuroscience. We have done almost a dozen videos so far, so don't miss that on our YouTube channel of 52 Living Ideas. And Sanjay, what are you doing today?
Well, today we'll talk about perception. It's one of the I mean, a lot of neuroscience is complicated, but this is something that most people have a basic understanding of, and we use all of our senses every day. But I'm going to go in detail with some of the senses, particularly with vision, because it's actually complicated, and some more ideas around how they work together.
Wonderful. So shall we continue? Shall we launch off?
Yeah, definitely.
The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So first, let me just, I mean, I normally have a slideshow for this. It helps with explaining the ideas, because just for a verbal talk alone, sometimes people aren't able to pick up on exactly what the concepts are. So what I wanted to do is let me get the slideshow going. Okay, so that should be active for everyone. So basically what we'll do, is that visible?
Yep.
Right, so let me start with, we're going to talk about our senses, you know, the 5 senses that we have. Actually, we have more than 5 senses, but most people know the 5 senses. But it's more than just having these senses. There are intermediate concepts such as sensation, perception, and what I call experience. And these 3 are layers of additional function that each of these senses provide to us, and they also provide a more deeper understanding and meaning about the world around us. So the first, let me start with something that many people probably know about, and so it's really a story about some people who went through some difficulty because of their lack of sensory, having difficulty with some senses. So there are really 3 people, and then there are 3 people who had difficulty with their senses. They were born, actually they weren't born, they each of them had acquired a permanent disability in their vision and their hearing. They were blind and deaf. And that caused severe difficulty for them, as one would imagine. But what I wanted to use this as an analogy for is really to understand what it means to know the world. In the write-up, I wrote a description that our senses are the primary ways that we acquire information about the world around us. And without our senses, we would really be, our brain would be, and we, our conscious being, would also be basically like a black box, with nothing going into it other than from our own body. So nothing external from the world going into us. And it's really our senses that provide this sort of information to us on what's happening around us. It allows us to function, to actually manipulate things in the world, to move about, to be safe, and to be active and functional in the world and survive. These are all things that our senses allow us to do. And without the senses, we would have diminished capacity. So the story I wanted to bring up is about primarily 3 people who had, as I said, they each had lost their hearing and vision in childhood. So the first is Julia Brace. She, at age 5, became what's known as deaf-blind from typhus, and that's a bacterial infection. And she was ultimately, she went to a school for, I believe it was a school for either the deaf or the blind. I don't remember the detail, but she went to a school for the handicapped. It was either for deaf people only or blind people only. And she was basically the first American person to receive some type of education, because prior to that, the medical community, society, scientific community really didn't have an understanding about the capabilities that someone who didn't have these two principal sensory systems, whether they could understand things, whether their brain was functioning correctly, what level of deficit they had. So typically they were not given any instruction. They were not sent to school, or if they were sent to school, they were put in with regular able-bodied students, and they really were not able to function. So she received some bit of education. And what happened was that the medical community and the teaching community learned a little bit from her. And the next person that came out of this was, her name was Laura Bridgeman. And again, these two people, both of them, they lived in the 1800s. You see the first one lived basically 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago. The second, Laura, she lived just about 100 years prior to almost 200 years again, prior to now. And she also became deafblind at the age of 2 from scarlet fever. And she actually received a significant education. And the reason why is because they basically had been taught, because they both didn't have the two main senses that we believe, seeing and hearing are the two primary senses that we have to interact with the world. So they both had to basically be taught using touch. And I use the term skin here because touch is actually not a single sense. It's actually, we have multiple senses in our skin, but colloquially we refer to it as touch, but actually there's pressure, temperature. There's actually a sense called proprioception, which is more than just our skin. It's actually our limbs and joints. It's a much more complicated sensory system. But these two women, these two children, had to be taught only through what we call touch, because that's the only viable sensory organ that they had. Now, Laura Bridgeman actually had lost 4 of her senses. She actually had lost not just hearing and vision, but she also had lost her sense of smell and taste. So the only sense that she had, the only primary sense that she had was touch. And so it was very fortuitous that she was able to learn and gain an education. She could communicate to some extent with people. It's believed her educational level may have been just below that of a high school graduate, but she was able to function pretty well. Not the same with Julia Brace. She had much less ability, and that was earlier because the systems for education were not developed by then. So one of the people who helped in both of their cases actually was Samuel Howe. He was a doctor, and he started a school for the blind primarily. And Laura Bridgeman was one of his first, not first, but she was one of the earlier students that she had with this type of deficit. Most of the students that at his institute were only blind, but she was both blind and deaf. And so he tried to find unique ways of reaching her and finding out what's happening in her mind and really trying to communicate with her to establish this way of teaching. And so he actually met Julia Brace, who was much older by the time this happened. She was around 30 years old, and he met her. He found out about the teaching methods, and then he modified those to teach Laura Bridgeman. And these 3 people actually are coincidentally linked together with a third person that probably most of you have heard of, her name is Helen Keller. And Helen Keller was born in 1880, and there is a picture of her, and also a picture. Helen Keller is on the left of this picture, and the woman on the right is her first teacher and only teacher, Anne Sullivan. And she was a very instrumental figure in her life because she really figured out how to go about teaching people like this. And she figured out that they are fully functional, at least in Helen Keller's case. Her mind was very, very precocious. She was capable, and it was very difficult to reach, to really teach her, because Helen Keller really didn't, in the beginning, she did, all 3 of these women really didn't even understand the concept that words existed, or that words, that objects had words associated with them. So if you don't have this type of understanding, the world is a very strange place. So Helen Keller, she became ill at age of 19 months from a brain infection. And she actually was the first person, first deaf-blind person worldwide to get a Bachelor of Arts degree. And interestingly enough, it was from Radcliffe College, which later on became part of Harvard. And she wrote a lot of books. She wrote a lot of essays and letters, and she traveled the world, met many, many people. I think she met something like 17 presidents, US presidents, and she wrote her autobiography. And in her autobiography, she described the condition that she had, especially prior to her learning to communicate with Anne. She described it as in a dense fog. And the key word is dense, that it was impenetrable. And I actually went and read parts of her autobiography, but the more interesting part were some of the letters that Anne Sullivan had. Anne Sullivan had kept letters not to Helen Keller, but to another teacher, and they were conversing about methods to access and how to go about helping Helen. And those letters provide a lot of information about how she saw the functioning of Helen Keller's brain, what types of difficulties she's undergoing. So it's really interesting. So this really shows us that that it is possible to reach out and that the senses are separate from a brain, that if the senses are damaged, it doesn't mean that a person's brain is necessarily damaged. They can have non-working sensory organs, but their brain can be completely functional. And that's really what happened in Helen Keller's case. The other two, they didn't have any damage to the brain, but the learning skills were not as detailed. So the concept first that I want to go into is the notion of sensation. Okay, and sensation is really where there is information from the outside world that goes into our brain through one or more senses. And I'm going to give a very simple example here. It might be a visual input that goes into the brain. And sorry. And then, another example here is proprioception, which includes a sense of balance. And, I'm just using a simple example here to show something. And then with sensation, there's actually memory that's involved. A lot of people don't realize, but at the core basic level, when we are using our senses, in childhood, our senses have actually developed. And how we use our senses, the range of information that it collects, the way it collects information, all of these things have memories associated with them. And that's encoded within our brain, as we learn to use each of our senses. So in this example, I have, sorry, that moved a little fast. I have examples of memories, but I have two types of memories. The first, the top three are really memories that are associated with our senses, and the bottom three are additional senses that are specific to this example. And all of these things together go into our together to give us the next level of understanding, which is known as perception. And that's really what typically happens after we sense from the outside world. Our brain takes information, and the information is usually low-level information, and it merges with our prior experience, our prior memories. It merges it with other information from other senses, and it develops what might be called an experience of the moment in that time that we're experiencing. And in this example, there was a man who was riding a horse, and his experience was visual information. He may have had some information about how to balance on this horse, how to navigate, how to use his various senses. So this is just a simple example that sensation, perception, and experience are all tied together, and they provide various levels of information to the brain. So The next, I wanted to go a little deeper into sensation. That's what everybody's familiar with, but it's actually there are a lot of things. I mean, people spend, I mean, their graduate courses on each of the senses. People spend their entire careers working only on a single sensation. So what I'd like to do is just go into just some of them. So our hearing, sense of hearing, and I just have a few slides on these. I'm not going to go into extreme detail with this, although I plan to go into detail on the visual system, but I have just some slides on some other ones. So the hearing, auditory system and our visual system are the two most important senses for people, because that's how we gather most of the information from the world. Vision is obviously the most important. And because of that, it actually, the visual cortex takes up roughly a third of the cortical area in our brain, of the the neocortex, the outer covering of the brain. Pretty much a third of that is taken up by the visual system. The hearing system, the auditory system, doesn't need as much space. It's in the temporal lobe and the sides. But what's interesting is that the way that these cortices are organized. So in the auditory system, it basically has two main areas, this yellow and purple area, the primary and the secondary auditory cortex. And the purple area, what we found is that it's actually split up into these regions of frequencies, frequencies being what sound is made up of. So all the sound that we hear in the world is basically electromagnetic energy. And electromagnetic energy exists at different wavelengths or frequencies. The same thing, it's just one is reverse of the other, the reciprocal of the other. So when we hear frequencies, we hear about, human hearing goes from roughly 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And those numbers are rough. I mean, some people have better hearing, the wider range, some people have narrower range, and that changes as we age and experiences. But so what this purple region shows is that it goes from the very low frequency range on the left all the way up to the very high frequency range. So this is split up into bands which seem to be double of each other. So the leftmost is around 250 hertz. The next one is 500 hertz, then 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000, 16,000. And this entire region consists of neurons. So in previous discussions, we've talked about the brain is basically a bunch of neurons. There are other cells, also glial cells and other cells, but neurons are the main functioning structure within the brain that makes things happen, that brings about all of the behavior that we have. And in the auditory cortex, this purple area, the primary auditory cortex, is actually all the neurons in that are structured to basically recognize specific frequency ranges. So what this means is that it's interesting that it's almost as if it's laid out like the keys on a piano, because this is basically what the keys on a piano are like. They are different tones, they are different frequencies. So as you go down the scale, the tones and sounds that emerge are higher and higher in pitch. So our hearing system actually develops to kind of match this aspect of a lot of our musical instruments, but actually this is an aspect of sound itself. And it's not understood exactly why it does this, and it's not from birth. It doesn't start off this way. It acquires this structure, and probably it's a fundamental aspect of how sound is, and also how our cochlea is the organ which actually picks up the sound waves. It converts the air traveling into our ear into the auditory canal, gets converted into these various frequencies, and then those frequencies go into what are known as cilia. They're tiny hair follicle hair cells. They're like hair cells. They're not the exact same thing as the hair cells we have, very similar. But those are also split into this band of frequencies. And each of these hair cells have a linkage through multiple layers of neurons to this the purple area that we have mapped. And that's probably why it is that way, because our cochlea and the way that we hear is based on these frequencies. So our brain actually structures that way. And so when we're hearing speech, what might happen is that it's kind of like if you think of on a computer, if you have an audio system or something, it has these it might have an equalizer, which has these bands of colored lights that show low frequency, middle frequency, high frequency, various frequencies that are active in the music that's playing. And this is, in a sense, what basically happens in our brain, at least in the hearing center, is that these various areas light up based on the sounds, simultaneous sounds that are being heard. So when we speak, we actually speak at multiple frequencies. It's not a single frequency. So speech is much more complicated. Music is a little simpler in that sense, but usually with music, you might have one or two tones that are playing simultaneously. So one or two of these regions would activate, and the other ones would be less active or not active at all. And the pattern that plays out, the other parts of our brain, the yellow part, you might say, is basically looking at that pattern of what's happening in real time. It's trying to make sense of what it is. And then, these neurons connect to other parts of the brain, and they try to understand exactly what it is that the sound is, the sound that's coming into our ear and into our brain. What is the information that's encoded in that sound? So, excuse me, one of the things that I want to go into is that all of the information that we get from our senses is encoded information. And it's not information that encodes everything about the world. The world has much more information in it than we are able to grasp or we're able to collect and get put into our minds. And we collect a subset of that. And so, for example, here in the hearing, we only collect a limited range of frequencies, but also the volume level. Our hearing system is capable of hearing only up to a certain level. So if there's sound that is very, very faint, it will not be registered. It won't be picked up by our senses. So there's many, many limitations that our senses have. So anyway, this was an example of hearing and what I want to do is go into vision next, because that's the main one that I really want to go into, because that's much more complicated.
Sanjay, I just want to make a quick point, just to have two different voices. It's really fascinating, this simple observation that our senses pick up only some things, within only a certain range of decibels, within a certain range of frequencies, because we proceed thinking that our senses are actually getting reality, are getting the object, but it is getting a very selective aspect of the object. And that is true for all sensation. And that's a huge, huge point.
Right. And that's true at all ages, at every animal. I mean, I have some slides later on that I'll go into this a little more, but basically so for example, we think that our senses give us a full picture of the world, but there are many, many other types of information, you might say energy. So for example, magnetism, okay, or electrical activity. Our bodies are not able to sense these. I mean, there are some theories and there's some research that seems to say that we might have that ability, but if we do, it's at such a weak level that the average person doesn't have an understanding of that. But practically speaking, we really don't. We don't have those as senses, but other animals do. So that's an aspect that I think is very important. We'll go into that in a little bit. But when I go more into actually, I think it's on one of the sensation slides that I have. But another aspect is that there are the senses. When we think of our senses, we think of them as individual and independent. But when we make sense of the world, we do so by taking information from multiple senses and tying them together. If we only had a visual cue of the world, we would have less understanding. So for example, if you're walking down the streets of New York, let's say, right? And you have no hearing, okay? Now, New York is a very auditory city, okay? There's a lot of information in the sounds. Obviously the traffic and the, a bicyclist or people, around you, crowds and things, but depending on if you go to Central Park, the birds, I mean, if you're only looking at the scene around you, you're going to miss a lot of information. and the same for most cities. They also have smells. So as you're walking by and you're passing a restaurant, sometimes there's an amazing sense of the food that they're cooking inside coming out or something. So these are all it's our senses are multimodal. That's something I'll get into a little bit later.
Excellent. Just one quick a funny story. My niece, when she was very young, she was about 2.5, and she used to be very scared of scary movies. So if a scary movie is playing, what she would do is that she would actually just close her ears. So I said, "Why are you closing your ears?" She says, "Because I'm afraid." So wait a minute, why? You're still watching it? Yes, as soon as I close my ears, I'm no longer afraid, because a lot of the movie actually depends on the sound and the music to such a degree that we don't even imagine how much of that is. So we mostly think of a movie as visual, but the sound component in terms of its emotional impact is huge. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, she actually picked up on something very, very essential, because when they make movies, the audio track is skewed in time. Sometimes the audio starts a little bit before the video starts. Also, the audio seems to imply or suggest what's about to come, and especially in horror movies. So your niece, when she did that, she was doing it very precociously, because it actually does hide a lot of the information that is scary. The visual sense may be scary to some extent, but when you combine the audio, the sound, and the scenes, it becomes much, much, much more.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I think Judy is waving her hand. I don't know if we want to.
No,
Judy,
we'll keep going. We will go ahead and take questions when we come to Q&A.
Yeah. Judy, if you want to type your question or something, or hold it for later, but we'll have a Q&A session in a little while, in a few minutes. So let me go into our visual system. That's something that's much more fascinating, and it's actually much more complicated. So I won't go into extreme detail, but I'm going to go through several things that probably people don't know. So most of you, I'm sure, understand that we have two eyes. It gives us stereoscopic vision. And the eyes have multiple elements within them. It has a pupil, it has a lens, it has a cornea, it has a vitreous humor, aqueous humor, there's a retina in the back. These are all elements that I think most people are just somewhat familiar with. But I want to go a little more deeper into exactly what it is that makes our eye function and how complicated it is now. Even this, I'm not going to go into the very complicated. I'm still having to simplify it because it is so complicated. The eye is one of the organs where teams literally spend, years, and sometimes, they can spend a career studying aspects of visual system or one of the organ systems, sensory organ systems. So our eye, the retina, is the main part of our eye, which is actually sensing the image from the outside world. And the lens and the cornea and the pupil and the vitreous and aqueous humor, these things are actually helping to bring the light to the retina. And the retina is actually a fairly large area. It covers the entire back area of our eye. An eye is a sphere. So if you think of it, the entire back region of the eye is covered with the retina. And the retina is actually very interesting because most people think of the retina almost like a film in a camera, or in modern days the imaging sensor in a digital camera, and it's not like that. It's actually more sophisticated, and it evolved this way for efficiency reasons. But most of the retina does not have high visual acuity. It cannot. If you the image that comes out of the retina for most of its space, most of its area, is very blurry, and it doesn't have a lot of detail. So what our body and our eye has done through evolution is it's put a very, very small but a very dense area of rods and cones at the center of it. Okay, so it's a tiny area, about 1.5 centimeters, and that's called the macula. And the macula has within it an even smaller area, which is called the fovea. which is extremely dense area that's concentrated with all of the most of the rods and cones, almost half of the rods and cones that exist in the entire retina exist in this tiny, tiny cluster. And that's the part that actually does most of our seeing. And what we don't realize is that our brain actually fools us into thinking that we have high visual detail all around. But what happens is that because this tiny area has the extreme level of detail and our eye is constantly moving around, it's usually moving around. And what our brain does is it keeps a memory of all of the things we've seen recently, but it keeps a detailed memory of that. And so when we believe that we're seeing a detailed view of the world, what actually we're seeing is we're seeing a detailed view of a tiny, tiny dot in front of us from both eyes, okay? And the rest of it is constructed from memory that our brain keeps in real time, okay? So we actually don't see the real world. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of optical illusions work off of this, because the image that our brain keeps is delayed in time. It's from a past. It might be seconds or minutes in the past. And our brain is updating it regularly as our eye moves around and our head moves around. It keeps updating it, but it's not always correct. Now, there's another element in our retina, which is very unusual, and that's it's an optic pit. And that's where the optic nerve actually connects to the retina, because that's where the signal, all the information from the rods and cones, kind of, you can think of there are wires that come out of the retina, and the optic nerve is a bundle of, you might say, wires. They're basically nerves that go into the brain, and each eye has a very thick optic nerve that emanates. But that area that it connects to the retina, we don't have any vision there. We don't have any rods or cones there. So the rods and cones are actually absent in that area. So we are literally blind in this tiny region on both eyes. And if you want, you can actually there's a simple test. If you hold your thumb, if you hold two thumbs out, I won't go into it right now. I think I did it in one of the earlier talks, but you can look on YouTube or something, and there are videos that show you how to find it. But literally, if you do it, if you follow the instructions, you will not be able to see the tip of your thumb, literally. Okay, and it's a tiny area. Your thumb disappears, and if you move it slightly to the right, you can see your thumb again. If you move slightly to the left or up and down, you see it again. But this tiny area, we have no visual ability. But when we see, it appears to be, we appear to see there. That's again because our brain has constructed that spatial element. So our brain is keeping almost an image of everything around us, and that's a very important aspect that we'll go into a little bit later. So this slide is talking about rods and cones. I'm assuming that most people understand that our retina primarily has two types of photoreceptors that actually pick up the light that's coming from outside. One type is called rods, and rods are sensitive to basically the intensity of light. And they don't detect color, they detect only intensity, but they're very, very, very sensitive. And also, I didn't go in this, I don't have an image here of the more complex layer. The retina actually has multiple layers. It actually has neurons within it. It has many various types of neurons. It interconnect this in this very, very complex tree and network that does a lot of pre-processing. So for example, within our eye, we can actually detect motion. Okay, and in many animals, for example, the frog eye is famous for this, that it cannot detect objects if they're not moving, or if they've been stationary for too long. The frog is literally blind to those objects. But if something moves, especially if it's a small black dot, its eye is hypersensitive to things. And in nature, small black dots typically are insects, and that's the food source for frogs. So the frog's eye, not the brain, the eye itself is highly sensitive to this type of motion. Our eyes have also kept some of this evolutionary ability. So our eye also detects motion to some extent, although a lot of that has moved to our brain because we have a much larger and more complicated brain. But the rods and cones are the basic elements that pick up on light. What I wanted to focus here is that the rods, there are typically from 1,000 to 10,000 rods that together connect into a single retinal neuron. Okay, so the sensitivity of the neuron to the intensity of light is almost 1,000 to 10,000 times greater than our eye has to color sensitivity. Okay, the sensitivity we have to to detecting a specific color is very weak, but the ability to detect the intensity of brightness, like in dim light or nighttime, is much, much more acute. So the rods are much, much more important for our vision. That's why, like if you go into very dark areas, the color acuity drops because we don't notice color as much, especially if it's nighttime. We don't notice color as much. That's the reason why, because we have fewer cones which pick up on color. Now, the next slide is something that it's a graph, and I will try to explain it to some extent, but I don't want to go too much into this. But basically what this is showing is there are 3 peaks here labeled S, M, and L. And each of these 3 peaks correspond to the 3 types of cones that we have in our eyes. We have red, green, and blue cones in our eyes. Now, just as an aside, in people, some people actually have 2 cones only. Some people actually have only 1 cone. Some people have 4 cones, okay? And so people who have 4 cones, people who are born with 4 cones, have exceptional color vision. They have super sensory vision, but to them, they don't know the difference because they don't know what someone with 3 cones has. They have 4 cones, so they have better vision than those with 3 cones, but they don't know how much better because they can't compare it. Their vision is that much better. The same goes with someone who's born with only 2 or 1 cone. They have color blindness, and that's actually roughly, depending on for men, it's a higher percentage, but it goes from about 8% up to almost 20%, depending on the type of color blindness. There are multiple types of color blindness. So what this graph is basically showing is that the cones, we have 3 types of cones, and the S corresponds to the blue. The S, M, and L correspond to small, medium, and large wavelength. Okay, and they don't really correspond to specific colors. This is a misnomer. The cones in our eyes don't pick up red, green, and blue. Okay, and what you'll see, the reason why I put this graph up is that this graph actually shows that the middle and the long wavelengths are actually close together. Okay, they're actually picking up green and orangish red, okay, which are very close together, and the blue is all the way out here on the left. So blue is distinct, but green and red are actually blended together. So when we see something that's, let's say, red, what's actually happening is, I think my mouse is visible, so I'm going to use my mouse on here to demonstrate. So let's say we're seeing something along this color, the orangish reddish color. So what will happen is that the cone that corresponds to the green, which is the middle cone, the M cone, that will pick up a signal that's low relative to this is the wavelength of light that's going into the eye, right? Let's say 600 nanometers. And so the green cone will pick up a little bit of energy. It will still detect a little bit of energy, even though it's not a green light that's coming in. The light is orangish, but the green cone will still pick up a little bit. But the red cone will pick up a large amount of energy, and the blue cone will pick up none. So this difference in energy between the 3 cones, blue being none, green being slight, and red being fairly high, that is what we perceive as the color orange. Okay, it's not that the red cone is picking up orange and the green cone is not. It's not that at all. The green and the red cone together, and sometimes the blue also. So for example, if you see in this region here, all 3 cones work together to pick up color. So this is something that's important to understand, because what this means, and these 3 peaks are not written in stone. Okay, our DNA determines where these peaks fall for a specific person. So some of these peaks are shifted for one person versus another. So that's why there are certain types of color blindness where the middle and the long cones are actually more overlapping. So those people actually have 3 cones, but because these 2 cones are overlapping so much, there's very little differentiation that their eye does. So effectively, they are able to discern only 2 levels of color. So they're similar to as if they were missing 1 cone, because 1 cone is very similar to the 3rd cone. And as somebody who's born with a 4th cone, typically that 4th cone is in the middle. That gives them increased acuity with color sensation. So this is just something so when we're talking about vision, these 3 cones, and then on top of this, layer on top of this, are the rods. And the rods have a broader peak, but it's not specific to any. They do have a chromophore, which is a molecule which picks up color, and I don't remember exactly. I believe it's in the greenish region that it picks up. But anyway, it's not specific to color. It's basically looking at intensity. So going a little bit further into vision, our brain has, in past talks I've talked about, we describe the brain as being divided into 4 primary regions, and that's arbitrary. We humans have come up with these 4 areas. It's not really divided in a sense. I mean, there are fissures and natural breaks in the brain as it grows and develops. These are natural breaks there, and that's basically what we use to divide them into these 4 primary lobes. So all the way in the back is the occipital lobe, and in this diagram, it's actually showing it a little differently. The blue is not the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is part of the blue, and also a little bit to the left of it. Part of the green and the purple is also part of the occipital, but the blue is only the one part of the occipital lobe. But the occipital lobe in the back, all the way in the back of our brain, is where we have vision. And what happens is the information that comes in from our eyes goes straight to this back area. And it first goes into this region, which is called the primary visual cortex. And our visual cortex is split up into 5 regions, V1 through V5. Those are just arbitrary names that are given. And they have specific types of attributes that they do. So the visual system sends information first to the V1 area. And then from there, and remember, this information is sent in the sense of neural impulses. So all of the senses that we have, what's happening is the energy, the information from the outside world is in the form of some type of energy. So for example, light is a photon, it's electromagnetic. Sound is vibration, so it's mechanical energy that moves air molecules or sometimes water molecules if we're in water. So there is some type of energy that is affecting one of our sense organs. So for example, touch is actually pressure. It might be light or it might be heavy. Our sense of balance, believe it or not, is picking up gravity, is picking up the direction of gravity. So each of our organs are picking up energy in one form or another. And so what happens is our sense organs are converting that energy from the outside world into ionic or electrical energy that is usable by our brain. Our brain only works off of electrical or ionic energy. So all of those sensory inputs get converted into electrical impulses that travel through our brain from neuron to neuron. And our brain, again, is a huge cluster of neurons. So when the information from our eyes go to the back of our occipital lobe, there are billions of neurons back here. And probably hundreds of millions of neurons are the first ones that are connected to the individual neurons in our eye, to our retina. And so what happens is that information gets processed to some extent. And then as it gets processed, the initial processing is fairly low level. So for example, initially what our eye does is when we see a scene, our eye at the most primitive level breaks down everything around us in our visual field into, we might describe them as line segments, angular line segments. And so they might be vertical, they might be horizontal, they might be angular. It breaks them down into color. It breaks them down into patterns. So for example, if you see fur, or if you see a smooth surface, or if you see something very bright, so these are very low information level. So one of the things I'll go into in a later slide is that the information that our senses collects can be low level as well as high level information, low density information as well as high density information. So vision is very high density information, but what our brain does is it doesn't look at the entire image first because it's too complicated. What it does is it looks at it in simple ways first. It tries to find lines. So for example, whatever's in front of you, so I have a laptop in front of me. So a laptop typically has a frame which is rectangular. So there are these lines that are forming the frame. And those lines, the V1 area in my occipital lobe is detecting these vertical lines and these horizontal lines, and the keyboard has these lines also. So all of these lines are being detected first, okay? And there may be regions of similar color or similar hue. Those are detected also. So these are the initial level of processing that are brain does. And then after it does this level of processing, it does additional levels of processing. For example, it tries to figure out which of these lines and colors form together to comprise a single object. So for example, a lot of these lines in front of me comprise laptop, okay? And other lines that are nearby don't comprise a laptop. I have a water bottle next to me, so that water bottle is not a part of the laptop, even though the lines are very close, and some lines may actually touch. But our brain has to figure out which lines are the water bottle and which lines are the laptop. And so that's a second layer or third layer of processing that our brain does. So basically, what this diagram is showing is that our brain takes the initial information, breaks it down into very simple segments, very simple precepts of information, and then builds them together and coalesces them into more and more complicated forms of information. And these more complicated forms of information spread out through the brain, because again, the neurons are what do the processing. So since the neurons all the way in the back here are dedicated for purposes of this low level processing, they can't be reused to do more elaborate work. They're dedicated only to do that type of work. So what happens is after these neurons have done that work, they forward the signal through neural impulses to other areas. And this forwarding happens in very slight gradual stages. So initially, a few centimeters away, it'll go to the north, the upper region, which is, in this example, it's called the dorsal processing stream, and the lower purple region is called the ventral processing stream. So this V1 area will send some of the information to the ventral processing stream. It might start off sending it a centimeter or two down, and then that information will be processed further. That'll forward it further down, a few centimeters down. The information cascades down until it reaches the end. And the same thing happens at the top in the green section, the dorsal section. So what this diagram is showing is that our brain, even at this low level, and again, this slide is showing a lot of low level processing. Even at this low level processing, what our brain is doing is it's splitting the field, the information that's in front of our eyes, into spatial information, location and motion, and the concepts of where and how. And all of that happens in this green area. Okay, it's the upper area in both sides of our brain. And this purple region is called a ventral processing stream. And this is basically trying to figure out, what are the objects in that scene, okay? What are the unique colors? Are there things that have the same color, the same shape? And what are those things? It's trying to figure out specific objects in the world. So these are two different, and again, this is a theory. So there are things in neuroscience that are, even though there are theories, they have a lot of strong research, a lot of strong data showing. So this is one of those that has strong data showing it, though it's still considered a theory, it's still considered a hypothesis, but it's one of those that's fairly well accepted, although there's still things we have to learn about it. But so what our visual system does is it breaks down the information into these two, and there's actually another stream that goes to the left, horizontally outward also. So there are multiple streams of processing, post-processing, further processing that happen in our brain. So this is just showing at the basic level, especially. Now, one thing before I go on, I do want to bring in, because the complexity of our brain, I want to tie a little bit together, because this is really important for future talks that we do. So this green region is not really a visual area of our brain. Okay? This green region is known as the parietal lobe, okay? And it's a part of the parietal system. And the parietal lobe is basically where we have a sense of space around our body. So all of the objects and things around our body, including our body, is recognized and kind of processed in this area, in the green area, and a little bit to the left, the green area. And the reason why is because this dark black line all the way at the center top ridge actually is a very important fissure. That separates the somatosensory region. Somatosensory region is a part of our brain which actually senses, and I don't remember if I have a slide for this, but this is where our sense of touch resides. And our sense of touch has to do with our body. But it also has to do with the things nearby our body. So for example, when we reach our arm out, the things that are within arm's reach, so our arm region is encoded in roughly this area. So the things that are in arm's reach are probably typically encoded in this outer area near this somatosensory area where the arms are encoded. And so what that means is, if we, in our visual system, if something, as the processing expands out and spreads out and diffuses out into other parts of the brain, if a particular sensory object encodes out toward the arm area, okay, what that is doing is that area is basically, it's learned to encode a lot of things to do with our arms or the region around our arms. Okay, and that's just because that's how our body is and that's how our brain is. Our brain is tied in this one-to-one correspondence with our body. So because our arms are in this area of the brain, the region of space around our arms are in this area of the brain, and our visual cortex also, when it sees things in that area around us, that's the area that gets activated. So if we see, like the water bottle, that's if I reach my arm out to hold, or if I reach my arm out to touch my laptop, then in this somatosensory area, I will have activation of thoughts around my arm, and thoughts around, you might say, typing, because there's a keyboard there, and thoughts around maybe something like a computing or computer, or it depends really how your brain encodes concepts, but my brain encodes the computer because that's something important for me. So the computer probably is something that my brain would encode. So I would have, when I reach my arm out and my visual system sees that my arm is near this computer, the visual cortex would diffuse the information from my visual system out into that area because my arm is there. It sees my arm literally there, and it sees the laptop literally there, and it tries to make sense of those two objects, and it makes a connection that the keyboard and fingers are both tied to typing, and computer is tied to information, things like that. So so I just want to tie that this green area is not just about vision, it's actually about our entire space around our body. And that space actually extends several, you might say, a meter or two outward. It's a sparse area that extends around us. So the next slide is a little more complicated, and I tried to reduce this as much as I could. It's actually much more complicated than this, but this is probably going to come to a surprise for most people. And this shows the complexity of our eyes. So what this is showing is this maroonish, bluish region in front, let's say, is a scene that we're looking at. Okay, it's just, let's say it's a piece of cardboard that's colored this way, and these, in the front here we have these two orbs, which are our eyes, our left and right eye. Okay, and what this is showing is that because of the physics and the optics of it, what happens is, let's take our left eye. Okay, our left eye, actually, if you look at it carefully, there's a region on the left side of this orb which is bluish. Okay, and the right half of this orb is pinkish. Okay, and this is because the light that comes into this eye comes in through the lens, and this eye is able to see a large, it's not able to see the rightmost part of this blue area, but it gets almost there because our nose is in the middle. So it sees a large part of this object in front, and it comes into the eye, and it's superimposed in the rear on our retina. Okay, but what happens is it's superimposed in reverse as well as upside down. Okay, so whatever is above us, in front of us, when it enters our retina, it goes to the bottom of our retina. And whatever is to the left of us goes to the right side of our retina. Okay, and this same thing happens to both of our eyes. So whatever is in the left side of us, okay, of our visual field, goes to the right of my left eye, left retina, and the right of the right retina. So both retinas, remember we have two retinas, right? Each retina on its right side has, and the right lower side has, an image of whatever is on the left of me, right? And that makes it confusing, because if our brain simply took everything from the retina and simply sent it to the rear of the occipital lobe, and the right eye sent it to the rear of the right, then each occipital lobe would have a merged image of the left and right. It would be more difficult for it to process. So what through evolution has happened is that our eye and our brain actually splits the signal. And this image shows a little bit of it, but the next slide is going to show it's even more complicated than this. What our eye does, and what our brain does, is it takes half of the retina, of each of the retinas, Okay, so the blue half is the left in this diagram. So it takes the blue half, all of the information from the left half of the retina on the left eye and the left half of the retina on the right eye, and it combines them. And in this middle here, you see an X, and there's actually it's a region of the brain called the optic chiasma, and it's actually literally where the nerve fibers come in and they actually crisscross. Okay, it's very interesting how it grows. It grows, you know, as our brain develops. It's very interesting how this region grows, but it almost always grows correctly. So the signals crisscross so that both left parts of the image come to the left region of the brain, and both right parts of the image come to the right region of the brain. So this simplifies the processing that our brain has to do. So the left part of our brain, the left hemisphere, only has to process whatever's on the right of our body, right? Because again, remember that everything in our brain is crossed, right? All of our motor system, our right hand is controlled by our left brain, vice versa, and our right eye sends information to our left brain, or the right side on our eye sends information to the left brain. So again, this crisscrossing is also in the sensory systems. But what's interesting here is that everything that our eye sees on the left half of the world around goes into my right hemisphere, and everything on the right half goes into my left hemisphere. And this happens to everyone. So this is very important to understand. What this is actually doing is it's simplifying the processing for our brain tremendously. Next slide is actually showing a little bit more because it's actually more complicated than that. Earlier, I described how the image that comes into our eye is inverted, not just left, right, but also up, down. So the top of everything in front of us goes into our retina, into the lower part of our retina. So our retina actually is split. So this is exactly, you might say an retina, but it corresponds to the visual field in front of us. The entire scene in front of us, you might say, is a round object from each eye. So each eye, this is what everything we see, okay? And again, there's a left half and a right half, okay? As in the prior slide, we had the aqua colored, bluish aqua colored. We had the reddish maroon colored, left and right sides. Again, here we have a left and a right, okay? But also we have upper and a lower. And also we have these three concentric circles, the fovea, the macula, and the rest of the retina. Okay, so these three regions have, from the center outward, increasing levels of density of rods and cones. Okay, so the central area has the highest level of visual sensitivity. Okay, that's where we really see things. Okay, only from that central point. And then the outer ring, the central, you know, the light blue area, is where we see a little bit more, but it's not as much. Excuse me, the outermost region, we have very, very poor vision in that area. It's very, very blurry. That's our peripheral vision. But because it's split up into these four segments, what happens is that the optic nerve from each eye actually gets split up into these four segments. And on the right side here, I'm showing, this diagram shows how this information gets split up into, this is the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere again. And each of these segments get split up into these 6 regions on the left and 6 regions on the right, because there's 6 on the left and 6 on the right in our actual field. So it's pretty complicated, except I'm going to explain why it is this way, because it's actually very, very simple once you understand what's happening. Is that the entire field here, so if you want to take the upper left quadrant of our field of vision, the upper left quadrant actually gets encoded into this one segment here, this bottom left segment, okay? And the upper right quadrant gets encoded into this, sorry, the upper right quadrant would be on this side, gets encoded into the bottom right segment, and vice versa. So each of these quadrants gets encoded into an area here. But what actually happens is that all of the neurons in these 2 areas basically represent the exact field of view, almost as a mirror. Okay, so everything that we see. So, for example, if I'm looking at this laptop, okay, the neurons in these 2 areas actually will also see the same image of a laptop. Okay, I'm not sure if this is if I'm explaining this correctly, if I'm expressing this in a way that makes sense to everyone, but it's important to understand, because whatever we see, whatever the light is in front of us, the photons that are entering our eye, okay, the neurons in these 2 areas get activated in the exact same pattern, or almost the same pattern, because the neurons are not in a perfect grid. They're spaced apart roughly in a slightly random, but roughly they are in a structure that's a two-dimensional shape. So the image that we see actually shows up in our neurons, the same image. So in the back of our brain, we literally have that image in terms of photons being converted into neural impulses, but they've been converted from photons, energy in the form of photons, to energy in the form of electrical energy. But the spatial representation is maintained. So whatever's in the top right gets maintained in here in the top right, whichever region corresponds to top right, gets encoded. So this keeps the spatial information intact. And that helps us tremendously, because that's the reason why our visual system is so spatially oriented, because our brain actually uses that spatial information. What's to the left, what's to the right, up and down, all of that information gets maintained. And that adds to the power of our visual system. And this all happened magically through evolution, that our brain developed and our eyes developed to do this thing. It crisscrosses, and all of the wires crisscross and go to the right place. It's amazing how it does it. Let me take a break here, and let's do some question and answers.
All right. Fantastic. So folks, if you have questions, we got 4 rules. Rule number 1, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask a question. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. And rule number 4, speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. And let's try to keep it brief, because let me just get a sense of time. Sanjay, how much more of the presentation is left?
Let me see what time it is. It's 10, just after 10. I need a little more than half an hour.
Half an hour. Okay.
A little more
plan
than
accordingly.
Yeah.
Perfect. Phil, what's your question?
You have shown us that, in fact, there's a simulacrum problem in terms of translating the world, both in the hardware and in the software. In the hardware, because the receiving signal is melted down into 3 colors and so forth. In the software, it seems to me, because it's an electrical signal, it's really reduced to on, off, yes, no, either or. I wonder whether this software problem is not the basis of our dialectical system of language at a very bottom level that reduces information from the world to a kind of understanding that's digitized. And so therefore, it could explain in part why our language system is so dialectical about either or, and that sort of very fundamental division between exclusion of the middle.
So yeah, I mean, the way you described it, our brain does quantize the external world, okay, and you're using the term hardware and software, which is fine. It does do it, but the software is actually not the way that you're describing it. It's actually more complicated than that, because the brain has developed in the same world. So the brain, when we grow and when we experience things as a child, the brain is mapping aspects of the world onto itself. So the connections that the neurons make, all of the connections that the neurons make, are an aspect of what's out there in the world. So it's not that it's quantizing artificially. What it's actually doing is and the quantization and the digitization is fast enough for our purposes, in the sense that the speed at which our brain functions, certain parts of our brain, for example, our visual system, quantizes at some of the fastest rates that our brain can do, because there's so much information in our in vision, in sight, and our brain has to process it quickly. Although what happens is that's the reason why our retina is the way it is, because if our retina had high density all throughout, our brain would not be able to process all of that sight so quickly. That's the reason why we have peripheral vision, which is very blurry and hazy, because our brain doesn't want, or our brain, through evolution, wasn't able to handle it. So there are these simplifications built into the system, the hardware and the software, that allow it to function. So I mean, you're referring to it as a hard, I might even use the word bicamerality, right? And it's not necessarily that. In some areas we might say it is, but in other areas it's actually a smoother transition between the two, because our brain has learned by observing the world. It's shaped itself. Many parts of our brain, especially our sensory systems, shape itself based on the stimulus that we grow up in. If we grow up in a very quiet environment where there are very, very faint sounds, our auditory system becomes more adept at picking up faint sounds, because it's almost like it learns to amplify everything because there are very few loud sounds. And same for our other senses.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Vanessa, Kevin, Dave, and Ed. Vanessa.
Okay, well, that table you showed with the visual spectrum with the 3 cones, I've noticed sometimes when the TV, they'll say it's like an orange dress. I'll see yellow. Is it possible that my cones are slightly askew to that? Maybe the primary colors is kind of set to maybe the default for the average human, or is that something completely different?
Okay, yeah, so this is an important point. I tried to make it earlier, but I'm gonna try to say it a different way. So the 3 cones that we have don't really correspond to red, green, or blue. Okay, that's a misnomer. And in each person that's born, and for that matter in the DNA, that we receive DNA from our parents, and so there are cell lines of DNA that we receive. So in certain cell lines of people, certain, and it doesn't have to do with races, it has to do basically with family trees. It may be that what corresponds to the long wavelength, which corresponds to red, is more slightly reddish. And for other people, that cone might, the curve on that graph might actually be a little more to the left, so it might be more toward the green. So the position of that curve varies from person to person. It doesn't change over time because that's fixed, although it can change, theoretically it can change through epigenetics, and possibly even, diseases can change it, but it doesn't change that often in a person. But over generations, it definitely changes. And if you look at all people throughout the planet, those 3 cones don't correspond to red, green, and blue. They're roughly bluish, roughly greenish, and roughly reddish.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Dave. Kevin.
Thank you, Sanka and Sanjay. I got a broader question. For people saying, I trust your gut, what you see is what you get. From what your neuroscience experience, what do you think about this? Let's say, how much should we trust our 5 senses? You mentioned the vision and the hearing. And next is, how can we use our 5 senses to help our brain do rational thinking, find the truth, or find the right track? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, this is an excellent question. So our senses are really like sieves. Okay, they leave out a lot of information, and we don't have all of the senses. We can't. I mean, I'll get into this in a later slide, but there's a lot of information out there in the world that we have no way of sensing. We just cannot sense it because we don't have the senses to detect those, primarily because they were not important for our evolutionary history. But in the future, they may be important, or even today, some of these things may be important for us, but we just lack that ability. So how much we can trust our senses? So there's 2 answers to that. And this is getting into, in the discussion that I wrote for this meetup. And again, it comes down to what happened in the evolutionary span of eons. There are 2 things that our DNA needs to do. One is it needs to encode for function, right? It needs to encode to give us abilities so that we can actually be successful in this physical world that we live in. At least we believe it's physical world, right? Based on what our senses tell us. So we have to be successful and functional in the world. We have to be able to see with enough detail so that we don't fall off a cliff, or that we don't, grab a rose bush and the thorns will cut us, or we don't, get chased by a lion or something. But at the same time, we can't expend so much energy in making these organs, because our body has to make each organ. It has to, manufacture and develop and replenish it over time as we age and grow. It also has to, as we're developing, as we're growing, there's a lot of energy that our body needs to run these systems. Okay, our eye uses a lot of energy, and our visual system uses a tremendous amount of energy. Vision is a very, very expensive organ, information gathering technique, but it's the best one we have. That's why we rely on it so much, even though it is that expensive. So this balance between how good is it to give us a complete picture of the world versus how expensive is it in terms of energy and complexity, and speed of processing, because the more complicated it is, the slower our brain will get, right? That's another aspect of it. So balancing these aspects is the reason why we have ended up with where we are today. And also with the number of neurons we have. If we had double the number of neurons, if our brains were, let's say, twice as large, or a little bit larger, it could be, packed in a little more densely. But if our brain was larger, it had twice the number of neurons, we would be able to do a lot more processing. So in that case, evolution would allow our sensory organs to either become more sophisticated, or we may be able to develop more sensory organs in the future. But right now, our sensory organs are limited. We shouldn't rely on them completely. But luckily, because one of the things that characterizes us humans is that we don't rely on our sensory organs as much as we rely on our cognitive faculties. Our sensory organs give us an understanding of the state of the world around us. It gives us a conscious understanding of the situation we're in. And it helps us to form models of the world, not just of the present time, but of long periods of time going back to, let's say, the Big Bang, right? So these models of the world that we've built up give us a more sophisticated way of understanding, and that's typically what allows us to function more as humans. Animals don't have that, therefore they're limited only to their senses.
That's excellent answer, Sanjay. I really like the way in which you bring in the kind of evolution of the senses, the cost of it, cost-benefit analysis of developing the senses itself, and the cost-benefit analysis of the processing involved. Thank you. Next up is going to be Dave, followed by Ed. Dave.
I had a couple of points. Phil brought up the idea of digitalization. The brain, I think, is actually a hybrid. It has both digital signaling, more or less digital, but it also has analog in the sense that frequency of neuron firing can be mean that the signal's either passed on or not, depending on frequency, which is simulates analog processing as opposed to pure digital processing. So it's I would characterize the brain, Phil, for you particularly, since you brought it up. I don't think this dichotomy thing is somehow the brain does philosophy or that kind of thing. I don't think it fits quite right. I think the brain is both digital and analog in the way it functions. Although you're right, it's a firing thing, but depending on the frequency, depends on whether the signal gets passed on to the next neuron. And that was the first point. The second point I wanted to make is, given the brain has a natural sort of capacities and proclivities, and I think the environment almost, you could say, programs the brain within the brain's capacities and proclivities that we inherit. But each of us is born into a certain environment, and that environment, I say, almost is like a programmer programming the brain. As you were saying, Sanjay, in a quiet environment, the environment programs the brain to pick up on very small audio signals. And similarly, say in a visual environment that's very complex, perhaps the brain is programmed more for the complexity than it would be with somebody who's in a less complex visually environment. That's all.
Yeah, just I want to make a point on, so the digitization versus analog nature. So brain actually is even more analog than you may realize. We have multiple neurotransmitters, roughly 100 neurotransmitters. Not all of them are active, but typically in any particular synapse, there are about half a dozen synapses that can be active. And so when we're talking about progression of signal, it's not only that they progress through these electrical activity, the neurotransmitters actually what make it much more complicated. And when you add in that certain neurotransmitters are inhibitory and others are excitatory, you have a negative and positive. So it is really much more analog than people may realize.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Ed, followed by Laura. Ed.
Yeah, hi Sanjay, an excellent presentation. And as you might know, I've become very much aware of the role of the macula in vision. As I have found out last year, I had macular degeneration in my right eye, and I have to take an injection in my eye every month, just about, for the foreseeable future. And there's been some improvement in that eye. The left eye is fine at this time, but I want to ask you, since it's a fairly common situation in this macular degeneration, and I know there's a lot of research on other types of modalities of treatment rather than the injection in the eye. It doesn't hurt at all, but it's a nuisance, you know, getting it, and it's sore for a few hours afterwards. What other protocols are being investigated to dealing with this, since it is fairly common for people, you know, my age, over 65?
Yeah, well, first, that's great news that that the treatment has been helping with your right eye, and your left eye has held steady. So that's very good. I mean, this is not an area that I can really comment on as far as other therapies that are available. And I had read up on it a few years ago, but I am not familiar with the latest the injection that you're taking. I think we had talked about that a while back, and it was a few years ago. It was it wasn't investigational, but it had passed clinical trials and it showed a lot of promise. So it was considered one of the more up and coming ones. So it's good to hear that it's really helping with you. I can't say what other modalities could help. That's not an area that is my expertise. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Laura, followed by Mike. Laura.
Sanjay, this was great. You've taught me a lot. I've had a lazy eye all my life and some really wacko eye situations today. So I think you've given me more information than any eye doctor or anyone. So I'm walking away from this much more knowledgeable. And I thank you so much. But I'm interested in the, you're talking about the left and right side being balanced and, so forth. So what happens, so somebody's born with this imbalance. What happens with the brain function then when there is this, congenital, I don't know what else to say, whatever I'm trying to say, congenital dysfunction, I don't know. What happens to the functioning of the brain then? How does the brain correct for that imbalance then?
Right. So, I mean, the reason why disorders like that occur, there are many, many reasons. Some of it could be in the aspects of the eye itself, for example, the musculature that controls the eye movements. It could be in the shape of the eye. It could be something physical with the eye that's not working correctly. It could be the control mechanism for example, there are nerves that control the lens, the actual movement, rotation of the eye, the eyelid, all those things. So it could be that aspect. It could be in the processing of the signals, of the optical signal. So in your case, I don't know exactly what it is, but many, many, many things that could cause it. And depending on what's causing it, typically if the problem is in the physical part of the eye, so for example, the eye is unable to move to the range of motion that normally it would, or let's say one eye can't move, or one eye is, the angle is actually fixed Actually, there's an article that I read last week in New York Times about an author, and he actually described that he referred to his eye as a lazy eye, but it's actually not that. He used that term because a lot of people don't understand what the problem is. The problem actually in his case was that his two eyes are able to be controlled completely, but his brain, one part of his brain, doesn't want to see the same image from both eyes. It's actually a very unusual situation. So his brain actually forces one of his eyes to always look away. It doesn't want to see the same image from both eyes. So that's an aspect of the processing in the brain. It has nothing to do with the eye. So depending on the situation, the therapy would involve that. But I want to say that a lot of times the brain can do things. In this case, the brain is actually causing the problem. But other times the brain can actually learn to correct for example, if somebody really has a lazy eye, meaning that the angle that one eye is viewing is deviated from the other eye. So both eyes get a slightly deviated image. If the person has this and they experience enough of the world, the brain can actually learn to superimpose the images slightly offset so that they don't have, normally the two images are supposed to be superimposed one on top of the other. But in that case, the person's brain may actually learn to not do a full superimposition, but only partial based on the angular difference. So, the brain it is plastic. This is the plastic with the neuroplasticity. Some things the brain can help with.
Thank you. Next up is Mike. Mike, did you have a question before you dropped off and came back?
Yeah, I did. Thank you so much, Sanjay. I'm really, really enjoying this. I had a question earlier you alluded to about how our memories as children can affect the way our senses develop or in our experiences, because something interesting happening to me watching the videos that you recommended today. In the first one, how can perception invoke pleasure? There was a lot of background music, and I was a musician when I was a kid, and it was funny that I was paying more attention to what I heard as an African rhythm in the background. And there was something of a xylophone, and I found myself actually calculating whether or not it was synthesized or a real xylophone. And I had to watch the video twice, because the first time through, I was listening as a musician as opposed to somebody prepping for this meetup. And then later, the Oliver Sacks, I think, TED Talk or whatever, I was glued to that from the very first start, because he began talking about a member in the nursing home, one of his patients. And my mom was in a nursing home a couple of years ago, and he really presented that as a storyteller. There was no background music, and he made the connection between my mom being in a nursing home and what it was like dealing with the nurses, and it glued me into the entire video. I didn't have to watch it twice. Took some notes down. It was very clear. So my question is, what happened to me today? How did my life experience affect how I perceive those two videos?
I'm obviously going to speculate because I don't know the experiences you went through. I don't know exactly what caused you to lose focus and lose focus from the main point of the video or the first video and focus instead on the music. But speculating, it could be that, well, basically some emotional, you made some emotional connection with the music first, or the emotional connection was stronger. But what seemed to have happened was that emotional connection kept your conscious mind focused on the music. So for some reason, you thought the music was much more important, that particular music, the beats and things, perhaps. Something from your past, probably. I don't know what instruments you played, but you mentioned xylophone, percussions.
Yeah, I was a drummer when I was a kid, and that's, okay. I'm sure the reason it caught my ear, but it was interesting how it overrode the the content of the video.
Yeah, I was also a drummer. So it probably because you're familiar with beats and you're familiar with the complexity of when beats come together, beat frequencies and multiple beats, something that you picked up, that your ear picked up. It's hard to say.
Wonderful. So Sanjay, I'm going to ask a question. You don't have to answer it right now. It's a general question. You can pick it up in any part of the presentation that you want. I want to talk about an apple. Me eating an apple, okay, or anybody eating an apple. You know, you're seeing the apple, the redness of it, you're feeling the firmness of it. You can smell it. You can taste it. You have all your senses, and you eat it. So it keep changing over time. You were talking about sensation and perception, and you were talking about how the mind brings together all the senses. So at whatever time is appropriate, if you could talk about what is actually happening in the brain when you are eating the apple, and how it is all coming together. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the next part.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I like that idea. I mean, I'll go into that not too far. I think I have just a few slides, and we'll be talking about that soon. Let me put the presentation up again. Share my screen. Okay, so I think this should be visible again to everyone. Yep. So the next, so we'll go into some very basic things. So overview of vision. The eye and retina convert photons of light, from the field ahead of us into electrical signals. The cranial nerve carries a lot of information. There's pre-processing that happens. The optic chiasm, we looked at that X where there's crossing. There's a lateral genetic body, which is part of the thalamus, which splits up the information again. And then it goes to the primary visual cortex. There's processing in the V1 area on the slide that I showed, but there's actually other areas that the processing happens. And this processing is progressively more complicated. We talked about the dorsal processing path and the ventral visual processing. And it breaks it down into more and more complex aspects of the world. So for example, in the beginning, you would look at specific characteristics and shapes and objects, and then you'll look at the interaction. Your brain will actually recognize the object. So for example, if there's a person there, your brain will recognize that the person is a human, and the person, all the things that we know about people, that they move, that they have a name, that they can communicate with us, all of those attributes would immediately come to other parts of our mind as soon as we see the person. So it's not just that the visual system only brings vision into our mind. The visual system and all of our senses, for that matter, bring other aspects of the world and the objects that we see. So for example, when Shrikant just talked about the apple, instead of biting the apple, first, if we just saw that apple and didn't even bite into it yet, okay, if we just happen to see the apple there, our visual system, what might happen is that we would have, so I'm trying to answer your question in a step-by-step fashion. So first I'll just talk about a little bit, and then after we take the bite, we'll go a little more into that. So first, when we only see that apple, we would be reminded of the various aspects that we know that our memory has already learned about apples, that they tend to be sweet, that they're crunchy, that if you don't eat them too soon, they can rot or whatever. That there are different types of apples. Some are sour and sweet, etc. So all of those aspects. So as soon as you see the apple in other parts of our brain, other parts of your brain, those other aspects of the apple would slightly activate. Okay, they wouldn't necessarily activate strongly because you only have a single visual cue, right? But those other aspects of the appleness in the visual space around you has been activated. And then if something else happens, okay, let's say somebody takes the apple from you, then a different aspect of the world around you would be activated. So, a lot of what happens in our brain is different thoughts and emotions getting activated, and ideas and objects, you might say, getting activated or deactivated. And when one thing gets activated, it causes a cascade of other things, related things getting activated also. So let's say that you take the bite of the apple at that point, right? Well, you're going to get multiple sensory inputs. So as you said, Shrikant, our taste buds, but also our odor sensation, our smell, both of those are involved in tasting. Taste is not tongue only. It's actually not much. Our olfactory sense is much more involved in tasting food than our taste buds are, but they work together. So we bite into the apple. Our teeth crunches in. We feel a firm pressure. So our jaw and our skin and our lips, all of those are sensing the proprioception around how hard it is to break the skin of the apple to bite into it. And then our auditory system might hear a slight crunch. Okay, now even before we bite, just breaking of the skin of the apple, our ears might hear that. And it might actually feel it, not just hear it auditory, because our jaw has bones. So the bone would carry the breakage of that apple into our ear and into other parts, not just in our ear. So we would have this cacophony of stimulations. You know, our eye would definitely have it, our nose and tongue would have it, but many other things would have it. Our various parts of our skin, our parts of our anatomy would sense various parts of the apple. And this is all long before we've even taken a single bite, or we've only started to take a bite of it. So going back to the visual, and I'll continue this as we go further. And then after processing to some extent, we start to get an awareness, and this is the conscious cognitive part of our brain. We start to get an awareness, especially with vision, but the same thing happens with other senses. We start to have an awareness of what context it's in. So for example, if, earlier I described the laptop in front of me, Shrikant talked about the apple. Once I have an awareness that that's a physical object, my visual system has circumscribed the spatial dimensions around which that apple exists in three-dimensional space around me. That the apple is here, not over there. The apple doesn't extend this long path. It's localized in this one region. And in a sense, the redness, right, helps me delineate where the apple starts and stops. And after that redness, everything else is non-apple, and everything inside that redness is appleness. So that is a cognitive expression inside my mind because I've had an experience with apples prior. And I know that there's firm flesh and there's seeds and things inside that apple. So all of those things are inside my mind. So as soon as I don't have to see the seed of an apple because my mind has memories of the apple already. Although the seed wouldn't be something that's activated just because I see the apple. It might initially be just, the sweetness of the apple, because that's usually a more visceral, a sensation that we have from apples, right? It's a stronger sensation we have rather than seeing a seed. So next, I want to continue on sensation. Sensation is really a process. So first thing to understand is it's a process. It's not a single activity. It's a series of activities where we're using a single sensory organ or a sensory system. And the key here is single. So sensation has to do with single. And later on, we'll go into multiple. But when we're sensing, our organs work independently. Okay. Now, our organs can work together, but that's not sensation. That's something different. And we'll go into that a little bit later. So a single sensory organ system is measuring a specific set of physical world attributes. So an organ can measure more than one physical attribute. That's what's important to understand here, because just like when we talked about our eye can measure the intensity of light as well as the wavelength of light, the color of light. It can measure both simultaneously. Our organ system is measuring a specific set of multiple physical world attributes. By converting and encoding those, encoding a subset of information that appears in the world outside into a series of action potentials. Action potentials are basically electrical signals for neuronal processing in the brain. So basically it takes the energy or information in the outside world, encodes it into electrical format. And once it's in that format, our brain can pick up and do anything it wants to with it. So there's a term for it called transduction. So sensation has to do with transduction. It transduces information in the outside world, or actually it can be in our body, because we also have senses that pick up information from our body. That's an important part of it. And this is the reason why, when we talk about 5 senses, we actually have more than 5. We have many senses that pick up from our body itself. Next thing is that sensations may use learned, and one of the newer forms of information that we have is epigenetic memory. So our sensory systems have learned how to behave, how to act, how to function in the world, because remember that when we're born, our DNA doesn't know the physical world we're going to be born into. Our DNA has been shaped kind of assuming that the world is going to be like it was in the past, but it might not be. We might be born on a mountain where the altitude is very different, right? And the weather is very different. So we don't know, but our sensory system has learned based on the actual environment in which we're physically born and have lived. So it learns many things. Epigenetically, their memories also, our memories can impact epigenetic activity in cells, including neural cells. And that's the aspect. So that's important with our sensory modalities. Another aspect is that some forms of our senses actually require our body to facilitate sensation, meaning our body has to do something for the senses to work. An example is our sense of balance. Okay, our sense of balance is one of those strange senses that if we're stationary, it doesn't work. We actually have to move our head to some extent to get a sense of balance. We have to either move it left or right, or like if we're walking, if we're riding a bicycle, when we're in motion, when our head, the relative difference in motion between our two cochlea is what gives us the balance signal. The balance signal is actually a difference between the signal between these two cochlea. That's what gives us a sense of whether we're in balance or not, and the relative rotational angular aspects of balance that we have. So that's an example. Another example is there's an NPR podcast that I listened to a few weeks ago, and in that it described a person who was blind. I don't remember if the person was born. I think they were not born blind, but they lost their sight in their youth. But because of the way that this young man's parents encouraged him to be active in the world and not to be, the parents were not overly protective. This young man actually almost lived like a normal person lived, but he kept getting hurt because if you're blind, you tend to get hurt. But because of that, what this young man did is he learned to use his tongue, his mouth, in a way that bats do. So he learned the skill of echolocation. Okay, he actually learned echolocation, and so and subsequent to that, years later, he was a part of the study, and he actually, because he was so successful at it, he started to try to teach other blind people the same skill, and he was able to teach some people. So he was a part of the study, and they did fMRI scans of his brain, especially of his visual system, because what interesting happened was because he was blind, his visual system was kind of vacant, right? Those neurons weren't used too much because he didn't have vision. He had vision early in life, in his childhood, but after that, those neurons were not used, so they were kind of taken up by other systems. But after he developed this sense of echolocation, his visual cortex actually was used to form something like images, but they were very, very low resolution images. The fact is that he did have a type of imaging, but they were not as detailed as our visual system, but still they were good enough that he could actually function in the world. So that's another example where some senses can be augmented by the use of our body, or in some senses require our body to augment them. And I have two examples. So hearing is one where we encode speech or music into frequency. So this one of the earlier slides that I had described that our auditory cortex has actually become structured that way because of this frequency-based notion of sound that enters our ears. Another is our sense of our body spinning, let's say on a merry-go-round via gravity. So that's another example where the sensory input is encoded, from the external world, from gravity, the force of gravity. It's not a force anymore, but we still think of it that way. Let me move to some more about sensation. So our senses don't capture the entire world, or even the true aspects of the world. They capture only a simplified view of the world. So, for example, our vision, and example I use with hearing is that we have a limit to how finely we can hear, or the maximum intensity we can hear. Our ear can get damaged if the sound level pressure is too high. Similar for vision, if the amount of light entering our eye, for example, if we look at the sun directly, can damage our retina. So not even the part about damage, but basically they're intrinsic, inherent limits in all of our senses in what they're capable of. And because of that, Our senses don't give us a true picture of the world out there. Our senses also can't capture all of the information in the world. So just give examples. There's some examples here. So magnetoreception is the ability to detect magnetism in the world. There are many animals that actually have that. Birds, sharks, crustaceans, they have this ability. And I put magnetoreception, electroreception, because they're kind of, they're similar, but they're not the same. Some animals have both, other animals have one. They seem to have hints of the other, but they're related. So that's a sensation that we don't have at all. Now, another sensation is that of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, we do have many types of sensations tied to the electromagnetic spectrum, for example, vision and hearing. Both of those have to do with electromagnetic spectrum, but the electromagnetic spectrum, is actually much more broad than that. It goes from pretty much 0 hertz all the way into gamma rays and very harmful radiation type rays. But infrared, ultraviolet, those are near the visible spectrum. We cannot see in the ultraviolet or the infrared. We have sensors and systems that can. There are certain animals and insects that can, but we cannot. Same for polarized light. That's another form of light that some insects and birds can use polarization of light. Then we get into things like quantum physics. So time, gravity waves, the various particles and fields that quantum mechanics describes, we can't sense most of that. Neutrinos, we can't sense. Buoyancy, atmospheric pressure, these are more rudimentary aspects of the world that we can't sense. So there actually is a lot in the world that we cannot sense. So and other animals can. And so for that reason, it may be important for us to be able to sense them, but because of evolution, our body and our DNA felt it wasn't important enough to encode those. Next, what I want to do is I want to look at some examples. Okay, so here's a photo, a simple photo, and what I did is, and the actual photo is color, but what I did is I want to talk about information. Information is a very important concept when we're talking about senses. So this is what I did is I took the picture and turned it into a simple black and white. It's not grayscale, it's simply just black and white. Okay. Now what you'll see is it's very difficult to tell exactly what the image is about. Okay. It's quite difficult. Now, depending on your level of analysis, how much time you spend looking at this image and what is there, you might be able to figure out some things or not. But it's pretty difficult to tell what this image is about, just looking at it. And this is because the amount of information in this image, I've intentionally taken out. I've reduced the amount of information. And this is, in a sense, what our brain does in the visual processing. The V1 area looks at the image in these simple ways first. It tries to, because in using this, we can very easily find the edges in the image. Okay? And that's, in a sense, what our brain does. It tries to find the edges. It tries to find objects that it should group together. And so information theory is a subset of measurement theory and also of sensory of animal or human sensory theory. They all overlap in many ways. So I'm not going to go too much into information, but I'm going to give some examples to try to help everyone understand exactly what that means. So in this case, here's the photograph. So if we go back and forth, you can see that, once you see it, you can get an idea of what the picture actually is, right? And you get a sense that the two hands here makes sense. And some of you may have actually picked up on that, because that's an aspect, especially when you see these down here and this thing that looks like a thumb, you might have picked up that this is a hand and therefore this is the other hand. And so this might be a person somehow. You might have picked up, but basically you're guessing, right? You're not really sure. It could have been something totally different. But once you look at it this way, it's pretty clear what it is, because here we have not only the intensity, we also have color, right? And we can tell that because this region here is the color and this is the same color, these are probably the same object. And therefore our brain, what it does is it because we have rules that we've learned through the processing as we have aged from infancy, we've learned that because these two objects have the same color, they probably are connected together. And because we have recognized the shape, that this is the shape of the thumb and this is the shape of the finger, that these happen to be connected together physically in what's known as a palm or a hand. And therefore, this hand must be behind this other thing that's in front, which we call an arm. And this arm in this case is blue because there's clothing. We know that arms aren't blue, but clothing can be any color. So these are the things that our brain is kind of figuring out in some of the earlier processing steps. And some of the later processing steps would be that this black object in the middle here seems to be a cat. And in the beginning, if when you look at it with low resolution, there's almost no information there to tell you there's a cat in the middle of this image. But as you look at it here, even then the information is not that detailed because there is not a lot of contrast or intensity differences. But this ear hints at it. You might be able to pick up that there's an eye and a nose. You definitely can see two legs up here, and there's, you might notice there's a tail back here, although that tail could be something else. We don't know. But in general, we can kind of pick up. And because there are two children here, this cat is of interest to them. So we're putting together logically, this is probably a cat. Our visual system might not be able to discern exactly that this is a cat. It might make a guess that this is a cat, but our brain picks up, our consciousness and other aspects of our brain pick up by the notion that there's two young children here. Their gaze, their eyes are focused in the same direction at the central object. The central object is small. Its texture seems to be furry or smooth because of the way light reflects off of it. So all of these aspects give us the sense that this is probably a cat. Okay, so our visual system gave us a guess, and our cognition gives us a firmer guess that this is, yes, definitely a cat. Although we don't know, it might be a stuffed animal. It could be a very realistic stuffed animal that looks like a cat. But for all practical purposes, we call it a cat because that's what it looks like. So here's another example about information. So here's a different image. And some of you might notice there's a few black dots on the image. Again, this image has very little information in it. We really can't tell what it is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cycle through an increased amount of information in this image step by step gradually. And what we'll notice is that we're going to be able to pick up. So here's a little more information. Now, for most people, you probably won't see much more. Some of these dots are larger, but it really doesn't give us much. But some of you may start to pick up on it because there are certain parts of our brain that are geared for certain recognition that I'll go into in a minute. But as we go a little bit further, now a lot of people might start to notice something, and I won't go into it yet, but some of your brains are really picking up and getting an impression that something is there, and you're kind of getting a hint that something is there. Now probably most people are realizing this seems to be a face, okay? That this seems to be a nose over here, and these two might be eyes. Maybe these might be eyes and faces here. It's not clear, but this definitely seems to be a face. And the reason why, and as we look further now, definitely it starts to look, this is clearly a face from us. And this also might be an eye, and the other eye seems to be hidden here, but there might be a face over here also. So what is happening here is that in this image, we've only gradually inched forward. We've only shown just a little bit of this image, but we've been able to figure out a lot just from a little bit of information. And the reason is because we were able to pick up this face. So if I backtrack a little bit, from the earliest notion, some of you may have started to hint. There's a part of our brain called the fusiform facial area, which is in the rear visual cortex near the parietal and occipital lobe. It's kind of in the middle. And that area, one theory says that we're born with it. Another theory says that it's trained after we experience. I've done a lot of reading about the latter, so I believe that it is trained, although there may be a slight aspect of it that we have from birth, but a lot of it is trained, and I won't go into that, but there are studies that I can cite later if somebody has a question about it. But the FFA area, in most people who have lived in the real world and have seen faces for a few years, that area is developed. And it becomes very keen to pick up on facial attributes. So at this point, most people would have started to get this kind of very subtle hint that, yeah, I think that they might not have gotten a conscious feeling. And this is another area that I'm going to go to a little bit later, is that when our senses operate, and again, we're talking about sensation, at this level, Okay, this is where these are just dots. Okay? The sensation might have gotten a very, very, very subtle hint that these three form a triangle, therefore they could be a face. Okay, that FFA area might have gotten a very, very faint activation of a face just from this level, but our conscious mind would not have realized it at all. Okay, if we went to this area, our conscious mind probably would not have realized it at all, but our conscious mind might have been on the edge that something weird is in this picture. And then we went to this, then our conscious mind might have gotten a sense that, hey, that's starting to look like a face a little bit, because the FFA area is really lighting up at this point. So it's lighting up, it's activated, not fully on, because this is not a full face yet, but it's lighting up enough in our experience that, yes, it's most likely a face. And therefore our conscious mind picks up on that, and we get this conscious awareness that there might be a face there. And then when we go further into this level, then definitely we realize and other aspects of the image also starts to put things together. Now, at this point, there's another thing that's going to come up, is that because of the, the very, very thin, faint lines and brush strokes, this is not a painting, this is the photograph, but this happens in photographs also because of the way information works. A lot of these very fine-grained brush strokes, these evoke a sense of fur to our visual system. Our visual system, as we've grown up, has learned to recognize patterns, and fur is one of those patterns that it's learned to recognize. So at this level of the image, our sensations would recognize very, very slight furriness in this image, but our conscious mind may not pick up on it yet. As we go further, here it's definitely started, especially if you look in this area, this is definitely starting to look like a fur, right? These protrusions outside of this seems to be an animal, right? Over back here, it seems to be more fur. Over here, this seems to have characteristics of fur. So in this picture, and especially at the top here, the top surface of this head, we might say, right, seems to be fur. So here, the FFA area and the notion of fur are two areas of our visual cortex that are really, really, really acting up, okay? And those have activated and gone into our conscious area, our prefrontal lobe, and is telling us, trying to explain to us that this is for little animals. They might be polar bears, they might be puppies, at this point we can't really tell, but they're furry animals, okay? And we can't go by white, because the white may be an artifact that this is a reduced information to image. It might be that these are actually brown for all we know. And now this image really shows us a lot more, right? And the fur is very evident. And now we can start to see that, yes, there definitely are 4 animals. And actually down here, there seems to be fur, so it might even be a 5th. And over here, there might be another one. We're not sure if it's part of the same animal or not, but there's at least 4, maybe more animals here. And they are starting to look a little bit like baby animals. They're either young bears or young puppies or young wolves. We're not really sure yet. And then at this point, definitely, right? And now what I'm doing is I'm just changing the information flow. Now what happens, and this happens in our brain also, because our brain processes the information at many layers. So this is another slice of the same image, information, the same image. So in this slice, it's all fur and the faces have almost disappeared. This, because we already know there was a face there, we might recognize it now. But if we saw this as the first image, we probably would not see a face here. We would just see lots of fur. And we might not be able to recognize that there are 4 distinct animals. We might see that this is like maybe a rug, or it might be a fur coat or something like that, or it might be a rough surface composed of fur. The information again is less in this image than it was in the prior image. This image has more information than this. And this image has even less information. And this is the actual final image. So as we can see, these are 4 little puppies. And this image is not, there is very little color information in this. It's mostly a black and white type of image. There's a little bit of color. But this is a low information image to begin with. But even then, there's a lot of information there that we can process out of it. And this is what our visual system actually does when it's doing that. These lines here are edges, right? So we use that to discern individual bodies. So this is one animal because there's a contour around its face. And because we know that faces have bodies associated with them, we know that the body is somehow hidden behind there. And we know that this puppy is on top Therefore, this puppy must be underneath it. So we automatically figure out, our brain automatically figures out the orientation of these puppies in space, which puppies are, because their eyes are closed or partly open, we might sense that they're either blinking or they're sleeping, the direction they're looking at. There's a lot of information we can pick up just from this image that it's not so much our visual system. This is no longer sensation. This is more perception, which we'll go into next. Another set of examples is, this is taking, so here, this is again low resolution, this is low information image. So here what we see is something in the middle of blob, and some of you might recognize it already. Here's some more information, etc. And then again, we see that the information is less, and then there's no information. So going back, cycling backwards. So this image actually has a lot of information there. And here we can kind of tell, if you look closely, these seem to be like little protrusions, very, very thin white things coming off of this. You might even think of them as whiskers. And once you get the idea that they're whiskers, that gives you a huge clue about what this thing might be, right? And so again, this is just the same image that we had earlier, except in this image, we can't notice the whiskers as much, but because I called out whiskers, if you look closely, you might see two whiskers have a slightly whitish tint that you might notice. But when you look at this picture earlier, most people probably didn't even notice their whiskers here. But because we looked at this image in this way, and this aspect of it shows clearly that there are whiskers coming out from this area, there's about 6 or 7 of them there, it becomes evident. So this is another aspect that our sensory system picks up on a lot of information, but that information gets boiled down and coalesced. So that information may have been used, and our sensory system may have picked up that there are whiskers, and that may have been used to come to the conclusion this is a cat, and it's not just a stuffed animal, that it's actually a living cat, because stuffed animals usually don't have whiskers that realistic. So if you want to, we can break for a breakout room. I had a slide if you want to do that.
Sure, let's do that for a very short time, just 10 minutes, folks. And when you come back, try to ask the best question you have. Try to keep at the core topic of what sensation and perception is and how it works. Okay.
And
so
I have a slide for the breakout that just to help people to focus. I want to ask them, what is a hallucination? There's 2 answers that I've given. I want them to think about which of these they think is true. Is hallucination an altered perception of the world that differs from what others perceive? Or is it an altered perception of the world that diminishes our ability to interact with the world?
Wonderful. Folks, I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. And in 10 minutes, automatically, you're going to be back here, and we're going to do Q&A at that point, starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right, so it's time for questions. And what we're going to do is that we are running very short on time. So let's get all the questions down, and then I'll have Sanjay answer all of them together. I'll organize the questions, and then Sanjay will answer all of them. So we try to get as many questions in as possible. So let's start with Jane and Vanessa. So try to keep your questions very brief and just list the questions. Jay, give me just a second. I want to make sure everything is set correctly here. All right, Jane, go ahead.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hi.
This is my first time joining this meeting. The topic was interesting. I don't have a neuroscience background, and I just want to say thank you, and I'm learning so much. And I was curious, I think there are conversations or explanations around how our senses are limited in many ways in absorbing and understanding the world fully in all of its, I guess, layers and yeah, like sensory. And so I was curious what your thoughts are on synesthesia, and what are the evolutionary explanations, if there are any, and is it a superpower? I don't know.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Great question. Next up is going to be Vanessa, Hugo, and Phil. Vanessa, what's your question?
Okay, mine also dealt with aphantasia is if someone, let's say the artist, if they could be drawing a circle, color it red, then realize it's an apple, and then complete the picture. Or if that's not easy to answer, can someone dream with images that has aphantasia? That one's easier to answer.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is going to be Hugo, followed by Phil.
Phil,
Go ahead and
go ahead and type.
Mark. Go ahead, Hugo.
Go ahead, Hugo. Yeah, thank you, Shrikant, and thanks, Sanjay, for this fascinating presentation. What comes to my mind is there was a recent experiment about the blue and the gold dress, and also like something about the like a piece of sound that was also perceived differently. I think some people, they were hearing something, and other people something different. So my question is related to this, is like how does the brain process optical illusions or auditory illusions? Like what makes the difference between different brains?
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is going to be Phil, followed by Ed. Phil.
Yeah, I want to continue Shurkan's question about the apple. It seems to me the first experience of the apple could be a trigger to a kind of narrative structure. I want to know whether, if it did trigger that, is it creating a preface to the story they're going to tell, or what Shurkan would call a pretext, or is it already the beginning of the narrative structure?
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Next up is going to be Ed. Ed, what's your question?
Yes, when the brain is subject to certain kinds of stimuli, like in electroshock therapy or an LSD treatment, many delusions are experienced. And even though these delusions cannot be correlated to reality, they often are very therapeutic. And when a person gets back to so-called real world, there's definitely an improvement in overall well-being. It's such a complex thing to explain, but
okay. So what is the therapeutic use of shocks like LSD and other things like that? Excellent. Are there any more questions? So I just want to make one comment, Sanjay. Sanjay, I thought this presentation was just amazing. I really liked it, because what happens is that the default way in which people think of senses is a very static way. It's almost thinking of human beings as these stick figures and thinking that that's living, breathing human things. We're looking at our senses by default like that. It's amazing to see the richness of it, the dynamism of it, how much kind of connection with the past experience, projection of future, anticipation, connection between senses, and all of this is going on. Just the brain is doing that. So I think our view of senses is like, like stick figures compared to human beings. And I thought you did a very good job of showing the richness of how much, and it's just the power of evolution. And the brain, the other part that you kept coming to is that brain has evolved in nature, in our surroundings, and it is adapted for that. So there is a lot of kind of mapping that has happened and correction that has happened through feedback that has gotten a lot of things. So I thought those points of kind of just making clear the richness, dynamism, and effectiveness of these systems that we have. And our notions of it are actually very, very poor. So I thought you did a fantastic job of that. Last question is by David. David, go ahead.
So Sanjay, I had a question in regards the vision. So if you consider light to be an electromagnetic wave, then your rods and cones are basically resonators, and they're tuned to specific frequencies of the light. Therefore, you can differentiate the colors. So if your rods and cones are basically converting the electromagnetic wave from the light into an electric impulse that's traveling through your nerves, the fact that it's actually an electrical pulse moving, it's also an electromagnetic energy or potentially a wave. At what frequency do you think that is? What do you think that frequency is in the optic nerve as you're processing a light?
Thank you, David. All right, so Sanjay, let's let's go through as many of these questions as possible. We are running late, so let's try to keep the answers a little bit short so we can cover through all of them. First one, if you want to take both the pairs, synesthesia and aphantasia. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I forget who asked, but you know, whether it's a superpower and whether there's an evolutionary basis behind it, synesthesia, and for that matter, aphantasia. So synesthesia, you know, is where we have where the signal from one sense leaks into, you might say, another sense, or usually it's one sense, and usually it's one directional. The people who have it don't really know it until later in life because they think that everyone has it, right? They as a child, they believe that everybody has the same experience they have. So they're not aware that they have something different. And they learn to live with it. It's not a problem. It's just a different set of experiences. It's not called a disorder for that reason. Evolutionarily, it's not so much that their brains are doing this as a new way of functioning. And again, there are many ways that it can happen. We don't know in a particular person. You know, typically it's not studied to the level of detail of exactly what causes in a specific person, but there's several things that can happen, but they all govern around the way neurotransmitters are propagated through the brain. And the affinity of neurotransmitters, the receptors, the prevalence of receptors. So it's around the signaling through neurotransmitters that's the part that leads to it. And it's not that evolution necessarily did this to them. What happened is that, and it's the same thing that happens with many other disorders, although again, synesthesia is not a disorder, but with other disorders, there are disruptions in how neurotransmitters work, which causes changes in how the brain functions. That's kind of what happens in synesthesia. Aphantasia is different, but I think the question there was, can someone dream from images if they have aphantasia? Probably not, because again, the aspect of dreaming is done in the visual cortex, and these people, their visual cortex is not activated from internally, it's only activated from external stimuli. So probably not. If they have dreams, it will be very, very almost invisible dreams, like not visual dreams at all.
Got it. Next question is Phil's question about narration. How, you know, what is the role of narration in this?
Yeah, and he was trying it into Apple. So with, you know, when we, so I guess the way to think about it is, when we experience something in the world, whether it's an object or a situation, it creates a state, an initial state in our mind. And you might say that that's the creative energy that starts a spark and the direction in which that story or that narrative will go. And the actual direction that that spark will take depends on what the spark is, the emotional content and context of that spark. So for example, if it's an apple and you just love apples, you're a huge aficionado of apples, and you happen to be making a bunch of desserts, apple flavored desserts for the next day. And so when you see an apple, it's probably not going to excite you as much because you've been seeing apples for a few hours already because you're in the process of making these desserts, right? It's not going to have the excessive excitatory response that an apple in the middle of a day would have for you, right? So depending on the context, depending on what happened, how it flows into a narrative and how it progresses into a story or something else, depends on that. Also depends on what is in your mind from earlier, right? What stage your mind was in, the memories you have. I mean, it's hard to say. This is all very subjective. Depends on the person. Depends on the situation they're in, and what prompts it.
Wonderful.
If the apple fell on their head, like with Newton, it would cause a very different situation than if the apple rolled in front or someone gave it to them to bite. So yeah, apple can be very different things.
Oh, wonderful. Next question is from Ed, and that is the role of things like LSD and whether they can be used for therapeutic purpose, and what do they do, and how can they help?
So yeah, this can be complicated. I mean, again, it's not something that I'm very familiar with. I mean, I've read things about it. So there are many psychotropic agents, natural and man-made, and they all again seem to change the way that signal flows in the brain, either through neurotransmitters or through electrical signals, and whether they're therapeutic or not actually would depend on the situation that person's brain has, whether it's a disorder or not. I mean, for example, a person does not have a disorder and they take these substances, or they experience these, it might cause further problems, or it might not. I mean, one thing I have read about LSD and some of the stronger hallucinogenics is that the post-processing afterwards is very, very important. That after you take it, if you are in a state of mind that is, let's say, highly traumatized or energetic or troubling or something, there are negative experiences around it, what you remember of it may not be as therapeutic. And so the context that you take it in or experience is very important also. There is one question that I just wanted to follow up on it with Brian. He talked about it with electrical energy. I wanted to go to just quickly. So it's not that the electrical energy in neurons is the same as the type of electricity that flows in circuits. They're not the same. Electricity that flows in neurons are actually ions. They're actually not electrons flowing. Electrons don't flow in. Electrons is how electricity flows in normal circuits. But in the brain, electrons don't flow to cause a signaling. Electrons do flow because they have to, because of the ionic nature. But it's ionic molecules that are causing the electrical energy to flow. It's the reverse. And molecules move much slower. So the concept of a frequency really isn't there. The frequencies are very low, if at all. And again, the energy, the signal is not carried only by electricity or by ions. That's why I usually refer to it by ions. It's also carried every so often. There's a break and a synapse, and it's carried through with multiple types of neurotransmitters. So there's no concept of a frequency for that reason. Now you might say that EEGs have frequency, but that's a whole different area that I'm not going to go into right now. But if that's the area you were going into, then we can maybe talk about that later. But by nature, neurons don't have any kind of frequency.
Sure. I had just one question and comment. I mean, one of the key things here is to see all these senses in the context of living action, because it is for the purpose of action, purpose of life, that all these things exist. So there are lots of trade-offs. For example, you're talking about sight, where you have the fovea, but you have this low resolution. Now, low resolution doesn't mean useless. Actually, it is critical to have peripheral vision to see what is there. And then you have to integrate it with the fact that you can actually turn your head towards anything that you need to do. So it kind of uses all these systems, some kind of low energy, some and low cost, some of them is like high cost, and in tandem, all the senses together in order to live. So you can't really understand the senses without the context of a living being. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean that's actually excellent. I mean the example you gave with the most of the retina being low resolution and it having very important purposes, but actually other things also that people may not be aware of. So the rest of the retina actually has many, it has rods and cones just like everywhere else, but some of those rods and cones don't go to the back of the brain. They actually have very different purposes, which are also important for living. So for example, we all, most of us know that our irises dilate, our pupil dilates and constricts. So there are actually special rods in various parts of our retina that connect to that circuit. So it's a whole different circuit, has nothing to do with vision. Then we have something called a circadian rhythm, which helps us to know when it's daytime and nighttime, or have this internal body clock. And that also is tied to specific rods and also cones, because the cones actually tied to the sky, because the sky tends to cast blue wavelengths. So blue cones exist in specific areas all around this peripheral area. And lastly, the peripheral area, just with eyes we're talking about, there are many things that, peripheral vision is sometimes more important than what we're focused on, because we might be focused on something that's not important, and something comes by that catches our attention that we turn to, and that's, because we're able to see it entering our field of view. So, there's many aspects to perception that we take for granted, we don't realize, and there are many other hidden things around each of our senses that aren't obvious at first glance.
The other thing I find really interesting is the comparison between vision and audio and the role they play. So for example, consider speech and writing. Like the speech, it's actually giving you so much rich information in terms of the tone, the pace, the emotion that it carries with it. And that kind of, you can take it in very, very easily, as compared to, let's say, reading, where you're trying, which is actually a construction. It's kind of using the visual sense in order to use a technology to use it. So any thoughts at a very high level about the role of audio and visual in human beings?
Yeah, so actually a lot of people don't realize this, but when we listen to someone else speaking, we don't get all of the information from sound. This is the reason why we like to look at each other's faces when we're talking, because even if you don't know how to read someone else's lips, your brain to some extent does. And when we're listening to someone else speak, for example, when we're speaking, sometimes the sounds sound like something else. The phoneme or the vocabulary or the diction, or there's noise or something happens, and we're not able to exactly tell what the person said. But because our brain is simultaneously looking and tracking the lips and other aspects, and the behavior that the person is making, all these facial expressions, all of those things go into also the interpretation. So today I talked about mainly about sensation. I want to talk about perception also, but we can do that in a later talk. But perception is a higher level function where we tie the information from each of the individual senses together. And perception is really, really critical. And then there's another layer after that, which we can talk about later also. But perception is really where we start to understand. Sensation, we don't understand much about the world. Perception is where we really start to understand.
Wonderful. All right, Sanjay, this is just amazing. This is a great series, and look forward to the next one. Just let me know whenever you're ready what you would like to do next. And I think I'm just tremendously grateful that you're doing this. I think it's providing kind of crucial pieces for me, and I'm sure for many other people here, because this is something that all of us need to know. So thank you very much, Sanjay. Good night.
Thank you for doing this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.